Hey guys, welcome to the Baby Playbook podcast for another episode. Thanks so much for checking in this week. This is a pretty special episode. It is a guest on today, a guest that I'm very familiar with, and you guys would probably know as well because I feel like there's a lot of cross Instagram chat and promotion with Anna and I. Anna Robinson is a certified nutritionist and wellness coach, and she's also my sister. So a little bit of bias in terms of having her on today. We've wanted to do this for so long. Anna also has an amazing podcast of her own called the Nourished Mama podcast. So we're both in this space, and we both, really think that it's beneficial to share each other's knowledge in the area. She, with her nutritionist work and her wellness coaching, is very focused on mums, which is such a huge point of difference of Anna, where she really understands what mums are working with, what their lives look like. She has kids of her own, my amazing nephew and niece. So she understands what we go through, especially within the first 6 months of motherhood and parenting, which this podcast obviously really focuses on. And her 7-day Mama Health Reset is just like a must do for everybody. It really gives you some great understanding of what you're going through, which I think we all lack. Understanding what our bodies are going through, how we're changing, and how food and wellness and nutrition can really help with that. Anna, thanks for making the time today.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here. We
I
could
know,
chat for hours, but recording
I know.
something is a little funny.
It is, you know what? And we've tried to do this for so long, but
Yeah.
obviously, even though we both have our own things going on, and we will see each other a million times during the week, but there's always kids running around, or mums in the corner trying to like help us with them. So this is like the proper time we have where all the kids are in either school or preschool or whatever it may be, and we actually have some time to chat.
Yeah, I can't wait.
So we're actually going to do something special with all of Anna's info today, and we're going to do 2 episodes. So this is your first episode where we're really going to hone in and focus on nutrition and that side of when you're becoming, whether it be a first-time mum or post-birth period, and you're coming into that period, and how nutrition can really help you thrive during that time and rather than survive. And then we're also going to touch on wellness as well next week. So this is a must listen, part 1 and part 2. Let's get straight into part 1. And in order to really cover both topics, Anna, I think it's really important that we understand what happens to our bodies after birth. What happens to us as mums? We've gone through birth, we've have a child at home, our lives have become chaotic. What's happening internally to us?
Yeah, a lot. A lot is happening. So basically, when we go through pregnancy, our body goes through this, vigorous process, and it can actually become severely depleted. And during pregnancy, this is totally okay. Well, not totally okay, but it is totally normal because it's part of the growth and development of our child. So we want that to happen. Ideally, we would have high stores of nutrition before we fall pregnant, so we're not so becoming so depleted, but unfortunately that's not always the case. So during pregnancy, our body will reach on all our stores of nutrition for the healthy development and growth of our baby. What happens is, then we have this baby, we leave the hospital, and everybody has an opinion on how to keep this baby alive, but nobody tends to tell us, or nobody has the conversation with the mother on what she needs to do in order to replenish her own body from all those depleted stores that she just doesn't have anymore. And then, you add sleepless nights, you add eating kids' leftover scraps, the stress and all of that. And before we know it, we are so severely depleted of basic nutrients. And then you start to see, those symptoms of brain fog, exhaustion, insomnia, which tend to often be, masked as hashtag mum life. But the reality is that a lot of these do come down to nutrition. Brain fog, for example, is a prime example of an omega-3 deficiency, which can happen a lot during pregnancy. our omega-3 stores are severely depleted because part of fetal growth, it needs those omega-3 stores. And then, we see a huge decline in iron, and iron is the leading cause of fatigue and exhaustion and burnout. So a lot of these symptoms that generally get flagged as hashtag mum life do really come back to that depletion that occurs, especially within that first 6 months postpartum, which is just so common. And one of the biggest things that I tend to see is that, again, people have such a huge opinion on what we need to be doing for our children and our babies, but no one tells us what we need to do for our own health. And it really can be quite simple if we have the right tools and strategies.
Yeah, I think it's really important as well that the fact that, we don't really have anyone advocating for us, like everybody's so focused on the baby. Everybody's so focused on helping with the baby, but there's this real lack of, well, what's the mum going through? And, she's the one that's on 24. And you're right, a lot of the time, I remember going to my mother's group and you'd chat and you go, oh yeah, I'm so burnt out. But like, you'd kind of laugh about it because
it's
like,
almost glorified.
Yeah, oh yeah, I'm so exhausted. But it's like, if you really tap into that, you're like, wow, like I'm actually barely surviving at this point.
Yeah.
I like haven't eaten all day. I'm not having enough water. And there's all those basic things, but then there's all those internal things that you say are going on. And, it's really, really hard to understand how every single day that we keep going in the same pattern keeps adding to that depletion. So you mentioned a little bit before, obviously there's so much going on during that period. I want to also touch on what and how does breastfeeding play into this? Because you mentioned when you're pregnant, of course, your baby is taking a lot of nutrients from you, and that's understandable. But then you have that kind of continuing into the post-birth period because of breastfeeding in many instances.
Yeah, and this is the part where you see mums just become severely, severely depleted and then end up experiencing severe burnout. And that's due to the fact that their body was so depleted during pregnancy, and then they go straight into breastfeeding. And again, there is so much advice and opinion on how to breastfeed from, a technical perspective, but there is actually barely any advice out there about what your body actually needs in order to produce breast milk, which just seems to be this like myth of a topic when it is actually so important from a nutritional perspective. Breast milk requires nearly more than 500 more calories from a daily average intake in order to actually, produce itself. It needs certain amounts of nutrients. It needs omega-3 fatty acids to create the fat content. We need to be getting in more protein. Protein is really the driving source of what creates breast milk. Hydration is another huge one. If we're not drinking enough water, then we're just not going to produce enough breast milk. So I think this topic is just not spoken about enough from a perspective of producing breast milk, and then also ensuring that your body has the right nutrients to not just produce it, but then to also be able to survive for yourself as well. So this is a huge one that I think more people need to be aware of, and making sure that we are eating more while we're trying to produce breast milk, especially more protein. We're drinking more water. We're snacking more often. After a while, I do, tell people not to snack as much, but during this time, it is so important that we pretty much are constantly having some form of nutrition and calories, because we really need to up that calorie intake in order to produce the breast milk, not just for ourselves, but for the baby as well.
So it's kind of helping both of us as well. I think a lot of it, and we'll talk about this, is like you feel guilty as if like, oh, I don't matter at the moment. It's just not about me. But you're actually helping your baby by doing this.
Yes.
So that's really important to keep in mind. So talk
Yeah.
me through, you mentioned a little bit before about, brain fog. What are the symptoms that we should be looking out for that perhaps are telling us that we're not getting that nutrition?
Yeah, I think, again, this goes back to a lot of those like hashtag mum life symptoms that we tend to brush off. But if you are, definitely memory, concentration, if you're struggling with that, again, I know this just seems to be so common, but it really isn't. And it comes down to nutrition. If you're feeling like really fatigued, but then at night experiencing insomnia, this is a real big one. And that's a real big sign of burnout. And then there's more of the other symptoms that come into play, things like hair loss, which again is really common, but associated to a hormonal dysfunction and nutrition deficiency. A lot of mums are experiencing as well, like dry skin. All of a sudden, they start experiencing things like eczema and psoriasis. This can be a huge sign of nutritional deficiencies, gut disorders that can happen, especially in those first few months postpartum. So definitely those type of symptoms. And then moving on to things like, mood swings and irritability. I get it. Like, this time is really hard and it's inevitable that we're going to feel stressed and all of that. But if this is happening constantly, if you're starting to feel like you're not yourself, you're very snappy, then these are huge signs of burnout, which can be restored and helped through focusing on nutrition and lifestyle practices. And this also goes back to as well that it does sound a little bit like, how am I going to fit in this stuff as well? Like, how am I going to focus on me as well? And this is where I tend to see that, unfortunately, in Western countries, we glorify doing it all on our own. It's very much glorified in Western countries. Like, asking for help is, looked at as down upon, or like you can't do it, or people feel ashamed to ask for help. But all over the world, in other countries, especially in a lot of Asian communities, they still follow that rule of thumb of it takes a village, and they have these beautiful rituals for the mothers during that postpartum phase, where they are basically doted on, that not just the baby but also the mother. They have these beautiful rituals that help the mother rebalance and restore when it comes to food and lifestyle practices as well. So it's really important that we aren't ashamed to ask for help, because at the end of the day, you are your biggest advocate. I always say this, and I know it can seem like, focusing on nutrition and doing these things for myself, I can just feel like adding to the load. But the truth is, there are a lot of simple things that we can do that make a huge difference to how our body, experiences this 6 months, and whether we fall under burnout or not.
Yeah, and we're going to get to some really simple tips that you have as well, where it is that thing of like, this can be overwhelming in its own right, and just feel like, oh my gosh, it's too hard. I'm just going to like run with whatever's going on at the moment and get a hold of this a little bit later on in life. But that's the most dangerous approach you can take. So we'll get to that. Before we get to these simple kind of tips and tricks though, what are some of the bad habits that are really easy to fall into? So you mentioned a little bit before about, for example, like not drinking enough water or eating the kids' scraps rather than making a proper meal. Can you share a couple of those bad habits that we are very easily fall into?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the worst ones I tend to see is mums having coffee first thing in the morning on an empty stomach. This is an absolute recipe for disaster. And I should preface this with saying I'm not against coffee. I'm not telling you to cut out coffee, but when and how you have coffee can really honestly determine how your whole day plays out. And I'm guilty of this. I remember doing this and thinking, why am I absolutely spiraling and it's only lunchtime? And it wasn't until I, started working in the nutrition space that I realized, oh my God, it's because I'm having coffee on an empty stomach, and I've done this for years. So coffee is a major cortisol spiker, cortisol being our stress hormone. And when we wake up in the morning as women, cortisol is always at its highest. So everything we do first thing in the morning is really going to determine how the rest of our day plays out from an energy and a mood perspective. And we want to be doing things that we know are going to help drop those cortisol levels. And drinking coffee on an empty stomach is not one of those things, because coffee will only spike your cortisol levels, especially, if you haven't hydrated your body first. So I always suggest to mums, hydrate with a big glass of water first thing in the morning. You want to ideally go outside and get some fresh air and sunlight. Potentially, if you can, I know this is asking for a lot, have some form of breakfast first, and we can go into later what breakfast I recommend, and then have coffee. Because by now you've likely already dropped your cortisol by at least half. So
Mm.
you've really set yourself up for a better day just by doing those simple steps. They take a couple of minutes each, but they make a huge difference. So having coffee on an empty stomach, going back to the question, is definitely one of the worst things I see mums do. Um, Another one probably is, and I don't want to call anybody out, but just not moving our bodies enough.
Mm.
Moving our body is so important, whether that means that, you're just going to go out for a short walk around the block, or, do a little bit of stretching on the floor while your baby's there with you. This can really, really help in terms of, just hormonal health, energy, mood, makes a big difference. A lot of the time we can get stuck in this phase of just, I'm just going to sit on the couch all day.
Mm.
And I get it, I've been there. But little, movement goes such a long way for both our mental and physical health when we're in that phase.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think we've all been there, especially on those days that you just want to like get to the end of the day, or you just want to get to the point at which your husband walks through the door and you think, you've been invited maybe on a walk with the mothers group, but it just seems so much easier to stay at home and not cause the fuss to like yourself or your baby. I think one thing, I think you taught me as well, which was really, really great, was especially when you start solids, I think we spend all this time like preparing lunch or a meal for baby. Just do the same for yourself at the same time.
Yeah,
It's like how we like buy all these berries for our kids, but like we feel like we're not allowed to touch them. There's this
yeah,
illegal rule that you're like, no, that's for the kids. It's like getting over that mental state and going, okay, well, if I'm going to be in the kitchen anyway for the next 10 minutes and warming up this like these solids or this puree or whatever it may be, well, you may as well make yourself like a piece of toast and get some stuff going for yourself. So like pairing it into what you're going to be doing anyway is also
yeah.
a
Habit,
nice little
yeah.
tactic.
Habit stacking is a mum's best friend. I always say this. Think about things that you can do whilst you're already doing something that you have to do, if that makes sense.
Mm,
Habit stacking is such a powerful way to get through things throughout the day. In the morning, I always say, if, for example, you really can't think right now about giving up coffee first thing in the morning, or having your breakfast first, then maybe start with, while the coffee is being made through the machine, pour yourself a big glass of water and have that first. It's the
yeah.
little baby steps. I always say it's the 1% things that you can do every day that compound and make the biggest difference over time. Um, but I can also get into some nutritional tips
Yeah.
as well as we go through.
Yeah, let's go into the food element because, of course, like your whole mantra is food is power. And that's like, if we really prioritize that, if we really understand what we're getting from it, that could really, really help. So you mentioned before, even like what could a typical day look like? What could typical meals look like? Let's get into that power of food.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of the time when it comes to healthy food, as women, we definitely tend to overcomplicate what that needs to look like. The other thing that I tend to see a lot of women do, and mums, is they go in with this all or nothing approach when it comes to health. And they just think, well, if I can't do it right, if I can't follow a diet, then I'm just going to leave it and wait. But the truth is that the way I like to look at nutrition and food and diet is, I've always said, rather than focusing on the things that you shouldn't be eating, try and think about what you can add, how you can add more of the good stuff. And if you take every day, with that approach, and every day you build on that, that's how you start building a really healthy nutritional diet that supports you without focusing so much on restriction. And I think that's a lot easier to think about as a busy mum as well. Something that I've always, lived by is, if I get to 3 o'clock and I feel like I haven't had enough fruit and vegetables, then I'll make myself a loaded smoothie. knowing that, okay, I'm just going to pack more things into my day that I know are good. I don't think about the calories in that
Mm.
smoothie. I don't think about whether I've eaten too much food and all of that. I just think about how can I add in more of the good stuff. Now, when it comes to the good stuff, what I tend to refer to is focusing on simple whole foods. Stocking your fridge up with as many beautiful whole foods as possible, relying on less packaged foods or having less packaged foods in the house is a really great way to make sure that you're getting in more of that good stuff. So think about things like fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, meat, poultry, legumes, beans, fish, eggs. These are all foods in their natural state. They haven't had any nutrients stripped from them. And this is one of the most powerful ways to use food as medicine. Every different fruit and vegetable that we put in our body is going to contribute to a lot of that depletion that we tend to see in mums. Mums can be very depleted in B vitamins, magnesium, iron, the list goes on. And reality is that if we're filling our house and body up with these beautiful whole foods, that's how we're going to get that back. That's how we're going to get that back into our bodies and really nourish ourselves. So number one is definitely making sure that you have more whole foods in the house. Number two, like, I'm not a big fan of batch cooking. I've never liked to batch cook, but I do like to do simple things on a Sunday or a Monday that I know are going to help me throughout the week. So whether that is just prepping a few ingredients. So every Sunday, I love to get all leftover veggies, chop them up and roast them on a tray and pop them in a container. And I use those roasted veggies in my salads as a side. In my breakfast, I whip them up with a little bit of eggs, or I make like a batch of rice that I know I can use in my meals throughout the week. So just a tiny bit of prep to get you ahead for the week. Something that can be really handy, especially in the first 6 months, is making some healthy nut bars and things like that, because our body just needs so many more calories, especially when we're breastfeeding. And this is a really good way to get that in, those healthy slices and things like that. The other thing that I would say is that focusing on creating some form of balanced meals is going to go such a long way. And when I mean balanced, I don't mean, portion sizes or calorie counting, but just making sure that we're getting a source of protein, a source of veggies, a source of carbohydrates, and a source of healthy fats in as many meals throughout the day as possible, at least, breakfast or dinner, because this is going to really help with our metabolism. It's going to help with our hormones, which is huge during this time. Our hormonal health in the first 6 months is all over the place. We've just dramatically dropped our major two women's hormones, estrogen and progesterone. So our body isn't producing these hormones as much, and we want to be able to sort of fast track getting them back, because these are the two hormones that women live by. Progesterone is our calming hormone, and estrogen is our go get 'em energy hormone. So
Mm.
the longer we leave our bodies without producing these two hormones, the longer we're going to experience those burnout symptoms. So we can really support that through nutrition and food, and increasing our protein intake as much as possible is going to help with that. And it doesn't need to be complicated. For breakfast, I would suggest having 2 to 3 eggs on some avocado toast.
Mm.
That goes such a long way, that breakfast. It's a balanced plate, and it also helps with cortisol, and it helps with our hormonal health as well. So, keeping it basic and simple, and trying to build as many balanced plates throughout the day.
And also, I know like your big one as well is like not to just miss breakfast, because that's the easiest meal to just like eliminate. Because, you've been there before as well. You've had probably like a messed up sleep. You wake up, you've had your coffee straight away. And because you've had that coffee, you have that false sense of like, well, something's in my stomach. And before you know it, it's like 12 o'clock. It's absolute chaos. You've only just put the baby down for like their 20-minute cat nap that they're about to have. So it's really easy to skip that.
Yeah, definitely. And I get it. Like, we've got so much on our plate, but really having breakfast is one of the fastest and most effective ways to restore your body as a mum and completely transform how the rest of your day plays out. It really is the most important meal of the day, especially in those first 6 months when you're getting sleepless, you're having sleepless nights and your cortisol levels are through the roof. One of the most effective ways to drop those cortisol levels, balance out your hormones and boost your energy is through a high protein breakfast.
Amazing. And we're going to be talking about sleep a little bit more in our wellness episode that's coming up as well. But let's, wrap this all up. I know you shared quite a few little tactics there. Do you have some super simple ones that we can abide by? You mentioned habit stacking is the way to go, just like small things you can do that don't require a large amount of effort and that don't become too overwhelming at an already really overwhelming time. I feel like you're maybe going to mention the matcha trick at the moment because I know you are on me about making sure I have my afternoon matcha. So yeah, what are some super simple things that we can try to start with?
Yeah. So from a nutrition perspective, I would definitely, the first one would 100% be, I touched on this just before, but would just be trying to fill your home with more whole foods. Simple as that.
Yeah.
Simple whole foods. So next time you go to the grocery store, I want you to think about, 80 to 90% of your trolley really being whole foods. A lot of the times as mums, I know those packet options can be quick and easy, but the thing is, at the end of the day, if you fill your house with whole foods, it really forces you to grab these foods on the go as well. So rather than grabbing a chocolate bar or a packet of chips, you grab an apple or a banana or a cucumber or some carrots, whatever it might be. Having the whole foods in your fridge, on your bench top, really forces you to then go, I'm going to make a salad with all this, or, I'm going to make a quick meal that uses most of these types of foods. So my biggest tip is just filling your house with more whole foods. My next tip would definitely be, from a nutrition and a somewhat wellness perspective, is focusing on a better morning routine. Everything we do in the morning is going to determine how the rest of our day plays out. If that means that you need to wake up before baby and, get yourself organized, have a big glass of water, hydrate your body, focus on preparing like a quick protein breakfast, this is really going to set you up for a much more effective day. It's going to regulate your mood better. So definitely focusing on a stronger morning routine. I have to mention matcha because this is one of my biggest mama hacks. Switching from coffee to matcha has been an absolute game changer for me. So coffee will generally give us a huge spike followed by a real big dip and crash in energy. Whereas matcha is very different to this. Matcha does contain the caffeine that we want and need, but it is a slow release type of sustained energy throughout the day. So matcha has a type of amino acid inside it called L-theanine, and L-theanine is it has a calming effect on our body. So when you pair that with caffeine, it has this beautiful effect on our body that allows us to avoid that big spike in energy and crash, and it just has a wonderful sustained energy throughout the day, which is just literally the best mum hack. Those would sort of be my main nutritional tips. Think about how you can add in more of the good stuff through simple whole foods.
I love it. And it does, as someone who, because I'm on sister, she does like hound me on these things a lot, she has that like extra, like, why are you drinking that? Or like, remember I told you about this. So I feel like my, 2 cents here is that like, it might take you a while. And like, as you said, I think the worst thing to do is, for example, listen to this episode and then all of a sudden like change every aspect of your day and like commit to 400 things in the day, and then that won't last. I've been there where I go, this week is different, and then I like take out all the trash from my house, and then I like say to myself, I'm not going to have coffee anymore. Like, do you know what I mean? So I think just start with like really simple things like changing, approach when you go to the grocery shop and like having that glass of water before coffee. That's a really, really easy one to do. And then slowly these things will, because you'll realize that they make you feel better, they will start becoming part of your life.
Yeah, definitely. It's always the 1% change every day that
Mm.
compounds and makes the biggest difference over time. And definitely as you start to tune into your body, you will realize that you do feel better, and your body will actually crave more of the good stuff naturally, especially if you do it, slowly, and you nourish yourself throughout it, and you're not hard on yourself, and you don't go in with this all or nothing approach. That's how the real habits get created.
I love it. Well, we're going to end that here on this week's episode. So just talking all about that nutrition, but Anna has so much more to share when it comes to kind of the wellness side of things, and things like, exercise, breath work, sleep, which is a huge part of making yourself feel better, which I know is really hard to achieve during those first 6 months. We're going to get to that next week. So make sure you tune in. But before you go, if you do want to keep up with Anna and keep up with the amazing tips and recipes that she shares as well, you can find her on Instagram at Nourish Us. And of course, I mentioned she's got the Nourish Mama podcast, which is so great. It's kind of like really well aligned to my podcast, where she speaks to a lot of experts on taking care of yourself and putting focus on yourself, and the 7-day Mama Health Reset, which you can join in on throughout the year. So make sure you keep in touch with her. Anna, if you're good with that, I'm going to get you to stick around, and we're going to talk wellness after this.